right. First, we'd like to welcome everybody. Thank you for your attendance at this webinar, where we're going to be talking about third-party risk management. Through HITRUST and Accorian's collaboration today, we're going to explore how organizations can transform their approach from siloed, inconsistent assessments to a comprehensive, unified framework that provides true assurance across your entire third-party ecosystem. My name is Andrea Brett. I'm Senior Director of Compliance Services at Accorian. You can see my quick bio here. Through my years of helping clients achieve compliance using a variety of frameworks, I've seen that third-party risk management is a consistent requirement that needs to be met, and I've seen the struggle. Jason and I look forward to helping you make TPRM a more manageable process today. Jason?
Hey everybody, Jason Core here. I work at HITRUST. For a long time before that, I was a security and privacy consultant focused on risk management, compliance, and regulatory matters, mostly in the healthcare space, but experience across other verticals like financial services and retail as well. I work at HITRUST on our third-party risk management team, and my focus is helping enterprises understand the cybersecurity risk that they're exposed to via their supply chains, and then manage that cybersecurity risk going forward.
Thanks, Jason. So I'm going to quickly run through our agenda for today. We're going to review the challenges that we face with cybersecurity third-party risk management. Jason's going to be giving us some stats on vendor risk and resolutions and how HITRUST can help protect the relying party. We're going to highlight why a unified vendor risk strategy is best, and give you a brief introduction to Accorian's GORICO product and how TPRM can be managed there. And lastly, we'll give you some business outcomes and measurable impacts of having a unified assurance strategy. We should have time for some questions at the end, so please put them into the chat when you have them so we can address them at the end of our program. All right, so here are 7 challenges that we face today trying to manage and evaluate our third parties. Fragmented vendor assessment processes. Departments or business units within organizations tend to develop their own way to evaluate risk, and when it comes to third parties that they use. This creates a fragmented and siloed process that may be incomplete, and it definitely does not help the organization as a whole manage vendor risk. Many of us use a manual questionnaire approach when trying to evaluate risk and determine the best third party for a job. This is a very time-consuming. You have to monitor completion of those questionnaires and review them once they come in. Many organizations have limited resources when it comes to vendor risk management. In many cases, those limited resources don't have the expertise to truly evaluate vendor responses, which could lead to risks that may never be addressed or until something happens, right? If you're using those time-consuming questionnaires and not aggregating the responses into a tool or a system, you may struggle to see real-time vendor security posture when making decisions. Manual and siloed processes can also lead to inconsistent risk scoring and evaluation of your third-party vendors. When managing third-party risk across sprawling vendor ecosystems that have grown from hundreds to sometimes tens of thousands of relationships, using a traditional TPRM approach, that manual assessment, spreadsheet tracking, for instance, they simply don't scale. As vendor ecosystems expand, so do those blind spots, compliance gaps, and risk exposure. Many organizations struggle if they must comply with multiple frameworks. So how do you maintain vigorous vendor oversight across those multiple compliance frameworks without creating operational chaos? A unified assurance program helps eliminate that chaos. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jason for some information on struggles with TPRM in the market. Jason?
Yeah, I think what really strikes me about that last slide is this idea of a manual or a time-consuming questionnaire or review, and also a lack of standardization. Like, to me, it's this very difficult situation where big companies have to outsource key functions. It's a key part of staying competitive in today's market, especially in the healthcare markets where HITRUST is most familiar. Uh, the fact of the matter is that vendors a lot of times can do key business processes faster and cheaper and sometimes better. And economics 101, anytime you have a vendor come up and start to consolidate these processes, they benefit from economies of scale and can therefore charge lower prices. And so what we see is a lot of times the enterprise is forced to outsource things from a competitive perspective to, ultimately offer the best services at the best price to their customers. They choose to go outsource things. And then what are we left with? Well, we're left with huge risk because this outsourcing activity exposes all sorts of including things like, financial solvency or misreporting. There's like DEI risks and governance type information. But what we're really focused on at HITRUST is cybersecurity risk, especially when you outsource processing of regulated information or key business processes that the business can't operate without. And again, a lot of times it is not a feasible business decision to keep these types of processes in-house. We see it all the time in healthcare, especially with things like population health, value-based care, telehealth, and I see a couple of CISOs from firms that play in this kind of business attending the meeting. So thanks for joining. They have to use you, and that exposes the covered entity or the enterprise to massive cybersecurity risk. And here are some stats that start to outline some of that, right? Like there's not great data in the marketplace. You go check the leading companies and ask them about, cybersecurity risk in the supply chain, and companies like Gartner and Moody's and S&P Global all go out there and they try to do their best. But at the end of the day, this data is well guarded. A lot of times it's proprietary to the enterprise. And because there's risk associated with it, a lot of times companies don't want to disclose how many companies they're doing business with or in what capacity. So we at HITRUST are uniquely positioned to track some of this, especially through the lens of cybersecurity incidents. But to that point, like here's some numbers. There are a couple good scorecards. There are a couple good reports out there. So Security Scorecard releases this report in partnership with a research institute, and it's called the Global 2000 Industry Titans. And what this does is it looks at the 2000 biggest companies in the globe, and and that's not just U.S. It's across the earth. And they start to ask them questions about how many vendors they have and how they manage that risk, understanding things like inherent and residual risk, and understanding the types of business processes that are outsourced. And what they found is that 99% of those global 2000 companies are directly connected to a third-party vendor that suffered a breach in the last 15 months. I mean, this is huge, right? Especially when you think about the fact that these enterprises don't have an option. They've got to outsource to stay competitive, and vendors are getting breached. I mean, that's just how the market works. In fact, everybody's getting breached, and the more vendors you do business with, the more likely you are to suffer some of these negative outcomes. The other interesting statistic is the cost of a breach. So I believe this comes from the Verizon breach investigation report, or the DBIR, very, very common in our industry. I think it's slightly lower within the healthcare space. And I think it's kind of hard to calculate too. I think ultimately this number underestimates some of the brand damage that comes with the reputational harm that comes with a breach. So after these types of security incidents occur, even if the security incident, the breach happens through a vendor, the enterprise that outsourced to that vendor is often on the hook from a regulatory perspective. So we see this in healthcare all the time. Same with financial services, and the damage to the brand by writing a letter to your customer that says, "Hey, I mishandled your information," I think is quite a bit bigger than that 10 million number. Other interesting stats on here and a number of anecdotes on the side. We at HITRUST, we talk to these types of enterprises all the time. Types of companies that have 5,000, 10,000 vendors. I've heard much higher than that. And we ask them how they handle this, and what we find out is that it's really hard. All of these companies are doing business differently. There is not in the marketplace right now a widely adopted one-size-fits-all solution. In certain niches, we figured it out. In digital health, HITRUST is largely the gold standard. In financial services and retail, we don't know yet. And we're seeing growing regulatory pressure from state and local privacy laws, changes to federal regulation, among other things. All right, this is my slide too. Okay, introduce the concept of a relying party. So, what is HITRUST? HITRUST is an assessment report. I think most of us on the phone probably know that. And before a company goes out, ideally before a company goes out and outsources critical business processes, they do this thing called due diligence, which is, hey, I'm going to give this company, confidential information. Maybe it's a competitive advantage, trade secret. Maybe I'm giving them connectivity into an environment that I need to have online to continue operations of my business, to make money, to serve my customers. And the question is, all right, well, how are we going to evaluate that risk before we make that business decision? Before we establish this contingency on a third party, how do we know that the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information and systems is at least decently managed? Uh, and we think the answer is that you ask for a HITRUST assessment. So what you see on the left here is this concept of a relying party, and we call it that because when you open up one of these HITRUST assessment reports, or a SOC 2, ISO, FedRAMP, CMMC, you name it, and when you open up one of those reports and you read it and you say, what were the controls and what were the exceptions, and is the scope applicable to me? What you're doing is you're relying on the results of the report. Somewhere, an auditor did an audit procedure and made a conclusion and put it in this report. And this enterprise, before doing business with one of these assessed entities, places reliance on that audit procedure. It is, hey, we think that insert public accounting firm or cybersecurity firm. We really like doing business with Accorian, right? We are placing reliance on the work that they did to know that they are adequately protecting the data and adequately ensuring the uptime and integrity of the services that we're consuming. And so when this relying party requests a SOC 2, they get, one product, and when they request a HITRUST, they get something else. And really the takeaway of this slide is that HITRUST is uniquely positioned to provide this type of value to the relying party. And so some things about the HITRUST assessment framework, I won't go into too much detail, but to just briefly address why we think the product itself, the actual assessment report, is superior, we've got a number of competitive advantages. So the high threat adaptive means the HITRUST assessment framework actually changes. So SOC 2, ISO, they're updated every 5 or 7 years. HIPAA hasn't been updated since 1996. There are other frameworks that just have a delay. And what HITRUST does, it's cutting edge, is we ingest threat information from the cybersecurity landscape, and we do it weekly. And if we see surges in certain attack vectors, we actually modify the framework. And so if this summer we see a 10x increase in phishing from threat actors, in Eastern Europe, we might actually go update the framework and say, hey, phishing is the most relevant attack vector right now. We need additional training, or we need to require through our framework that companies do additional phishing testing or training or education, or things like email filtering and spam detection, just to stop these phishing attacks. And the same thing applies to every other threat vector that you could think of. Right now, the big idea is that there's 0 days in everybody's operating system that Claude just discovered. I don't know if anybody's read about that, but when they released the new Claude model, it found hundreds of 0-day vulnerabilities in very, very critical infrastructure, things like Windows and Linux, Unix, and the operating systems that keep our economy and our systems online across the globe, really. And one of the things that HITRUST is doing is understanding when these 0-day vulnerabilities appear, what do we need to do to detect and mitigate the risk that those vulnerabilities are exploited in a way that is negative for the business. So to bring it all back together, the idea is that this relying party shouldn't have to read the report and say, do you have the right 0-day controls? The relying party shouldn't have to read the report and say, there's been a surge in phishing. Do you have the right phishing controls? The relying party should be able to say, hey, do you have a high trust assessment report? And know that because of the way that the product is built, that the controls are appropriate to mitigate the risks that that vendor faces in the landscape today. And again, ultimately are doing this to manage risk to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of their systems and data. There are a number of other things on here. I'll touch briefly on the trust report. If anybody hasn't read that, shoot us an email after. We'll get you a copy. HITRUST is again uniquely positioned in that we know when incidents happen for HITRUST certified systems. One, in part because a lot of times lawsuits are filed, so we see, but also because HITRUST certified companies have contractual obligations to us to notify when negative security outcomes happen. And I say that word intentionally because it is not always a breach, right? A lot of times it's associated with a suspected incident and investigation. And we watch and we learn. And what we can do effectively, because we understand the assessment results and we understand the security outcomes, we can actually predict the likelihood that any particular HITRUST environment is popped, is breached, or otherwise compromised in a given period. And our flagship, our headline number is that it is lower than 1%. Actually, it's closer to 0.5% than 1%. And so if a relying party goes out there and tries to model the likelihood that systems will go down, turns out there's not a lot of good data, right? We say, how many vendors get breached in a year? Nobody knows. We can't even tell you how many companies are out there in a given year. But what we do know is that the likelihood with a HITRUST assessment is less than 1%.
Thanks. Yes, Jason, I can tell you, Accorian is an external assessor company for HITRUST. So when we have clients that are using vendors that have required or the vendor has been proactive to achieve certification for HITRUST, that tells us as the assessor that our client has a very good risk strategy when it comes to using those third parties. So HITRUST is kind of the gold standard of assessment. So we rely on that, and we know that our clients do as well. So that's very important information.
Yeah, I see some really, really thoughtful insight from Stephen D in the chat. I think, Andrea, it makes sense to touch on briefly.
Sure.
As we were talking about breaches, he points out that we use that word synonymously to mean a breach of contract or service level agreement. So if AWS, a shark eats the cable and it goes out, I think that actually happened in the 2020s. Maybe it was GCP. A shark bit the cable and it went out. And at that time, the cloud service provider had a 99% uptime guarantee. And
Right.
they were 97% up. So that is a breach of contract. In that case, the hosting provider made a service level agreement to the relying party and breached it, right? Breach of contract. And that is distinct and separate from the idea that regulated data is breached, which means that an external party, an unauthorized party, be it a threat actor or just some guy on the street that picks it up, starts to read regulated information. And this is actually a common threat vector too in healthcare. For a long time, the biggest and worst data breaches were people misplacing files. If you leave an unencrypted laptop on the subway, well, that's breached. Anybody can pick that up and read it, right? And same thing with physical mail. You print out 100,000 medical bills, which is not a low number of bills to send out for a health system. And that stack of papers gets dropped with the wrong courier. Well, that's a breach, right? And that is totally different from the idea of breaching your contractual commitments. Um, and then I think the last thing that I'd like to address really quickly from Stephen's really insightful questions are just human rights. And you bring up a good point. When these breaches, not breaches of service level agreements or contractual commitments, but breaches of your obligation, the relying party's obligation to protect health information, at least, when this occurs, it's not processed by a public accounting firm or some odd department of the government. When healthcare data is breached, it's investigated by the Office for Civil Rights. This is the US. We got cameras on every corner capturing our license plate. Our phones track every movement. They know where we are. They know what we're doing. And we don't really have a right to privacy except in healthcare. or for people under 14. But in healthcare, it is a civil right. It is a human right that your healthcare is protected. And when you go into a doctor, you can trust that they're going to protect it. It's not going to be sold. It's not going to be used to discriminate against you. It's not going to be used to tailor the services or marketing that they do towards you. It is your right to have a private relationship with your doctor. And the federal government takes that very, very seriously. The Office for Civil Rights, again, prosecutes this. And even when that breach occurs through a vendor, guess what? OCR is not going after the vendor. Well, they might, but OCR is going back to the relying party, to the health system or insurance plan, and saying, why did you give this data to a vendor who wasn't prepared to protect it? And that's just the gravity of the situation that we're dealing with in the markets today. And again, it all happened after the fact, right? We were pressed hard for economic advantages. Companies had to go out and outsource to offer services at a competitive price. And then on the back end, we got all these problems we got to go grapple with around protecting sensitive data.
Yeah. Exactly. And there's a self-reporting requirement as well.
That's right.
You must self-report. So, all right. So as Jess and I have shared with you, obviously the struggles that many organizations face when it comes to TPRM. Now we can talk about why a unified vendor risk strategy matters, right? So this unified approach, it gives you a single source of truth for all vendor risk data within your organization. So nobody needs to reinvent the wheel. If another business unit's already evaluated a particular vendor, why go and reevaluate them? You also can get a consistent risk evaluation for all vendors when you use the same process across the board. So one business unit may be looking at a certain number of questions that they ask a vendor. Another business unit may ask us another set of questions. Consolidate those questions when you're unified and get the answers all at one time, and then use the data accordingly. Streamline workflows within TPRM solutions, reduce the redundancy, and improve efficiency. So it helps alleviate stress when you may not have those designated resources that we talked about earlier, when you don't have them strictly for vendor management. Collaboration really is the key. Have that required information in one solution. It allows business units of that relying party to consult with each other, look at the risk collaboratively, and make informed decisions. Unified TPRM solutions can also anticipate and prevent vendor risk before they materialize into those incidents that we were talking about, rather than simply responding after a problem occurs. You don't want to have to self-report. All of which can reduce organizational exposure to third-party cyber threats, which is our goal. So the next few slides are going to give you a brief look at Accorian's TPRM solution, which is called GORICO. So GORICO centralizes and streamlines that vendor management from onboarding and inventory of vendors to automated classification and then offboarding when that occurs. It gives you usability from both the sell side, which is the third party's perspective, and also from the buy side, which is the organization or that relying party that Jason mentioned, from that perspective. It's automated. It helps organizations make data-driven decisions using real-time dashboards to provide that very clear view of your vendor landscape. GORICO also uses AI-powered risk scoring and analytics, which assist in decision-making. And then if you're one of those organizations that must comply with those multiple frameworks, GORICO has a dynamic risk assessment, which allows customization of those questionnaires. Again, as I mentioned, ask all those questions once, and then evaluate risk across all of those frameworks. We are also in the process of integrating HITRUST and SOC 2 reports into GORICO. So those HITRUST certifications, the full reports that vendors could get from HITRUST, can be eventually be ingested into GORICO, and that allows automatic responses and scoring based on those trusted assessments that have already been performed by those third parties. Here's a quick look at GORICO's actionable executive dashboard. This is where you can gain that real-time visibility into the entire vendor landscape, data-driven visualizations, and they support strategic retention and investment decisions. And then lastly, this is again, how GORICO can simplify and accelerate your TPRM journey. The blended approach of GORICO integrates expert security advisory with GORICO through AI and some human interaction as well. You move beyond static manual spreadsheets and reduce risk. We can turn vendor risk into a continuous intelligence-driven managed service for both your buy side and the sell side that we mentioned earlier. So as I briefly touched on earlier, here's some from the buy side. You've got that AI-driven classification of vendors, smart assessment and evidence collection. So those reports that are provided, you can reduce that manual review of questionnaires and evidence, as well as the manual review of the questionnaires first, and then the evidence would be those third-party reports. Expert-led continuous monitoring. So outside of the use of AI, we have real-time monitoring as well. So anything that might be missed from the AI side doesn't get overlooked. Then from the sell side, or the third-party side, there is a centralized knowledge base and repository. So you, as a third party, as a vendor, you can then show your potential customers, you grant them access to the portal, and they can see what your current compliance state is. So I'm going to turn it back over to Jason to tell you how HITRUST can assist in addressing third-party cyber risk. Jason?
Oh, great. Yeah, well, I already touched on a lot of this stuff. Sometimes I get a little bit ahead of myself, but I think Andrew's talking a little bit about this challenge that we see in the market today where we need to do this third-party assurance or third-party risk management. We also hear it called vendor lifecycle management and a number of other names. But this idea that we need to understand who we're doing business with, the inherent risk associated with that business decision. So if I run a hospital and I outsource all my doctors, that has one risk profile. If I outsource all my medical records, that has another profile. And I keep going to healthcare because that's my background, but we serve financial services and retail and other industries as well, number in manufacturing and critical infrastructure. And the idea behind GORICO and behind HITRUST, and they're not mutually exclusive, by the way. The idea is there should be a way to say, hey, company, what are you doing with my data? And can I deduce my risk profile based on what you're doing with my data? And we call that inherent risk. And then how are you going to prove to me that you are managing the inherent risk? I've trusted you with this process, and there's the name trust. It's in our name, right? I have trusted you with something critical to my business. I've made the decision to do this with you. How are you protecting it? Be it uptime, SLAs, regulatory requirements, general confidentiality. What are you doing to protect it? And we think the best way to prove it is with an independent external audit. And we think that, and there are a number of those, right? You can get a SOC 2 or an ISO. Things like FedRAMP and PCI usually have scoping nuance that make them not feasible for the purposes we're discussing today, although, I mean, it's better than nothing. And we think that the HITRUST framework, because of things like threat adaptive and inheritance and our QA process and in our proven security outcomes, we think asking for HITRUST is the best way to prove that you're protecting things. So we think two things. We think a vendor that wants to be competitive in the marketplace would be excited to go get a HITRUST assessment report and say, look at me, my breach rate is this much lower than the industry average. Or I can demonstrate that I have a low likelihood to be breached because HITRUST has this thing called the trust report, and no other framework can do that. That's the first part. The second part is if you run an enterprise third-party risk management program and you need to manage 10,000 vendors, and we assume the breach rate is 10% in the marketplace, a compromise rate, that's 100 breaches a year, right? Or 1,000 breaches a year. And that's not out of the question for some of the companies that I talk to. They get a letter in the mail that says, notice of breach, 164 CFR, that's HIPAA. And the costs associated with that are huge. If nothing else, just the ongoing investigation over and over again. Okay, who is this person? What data do they have? Do they have connectivity into my systems? Have my systems been compromised? What do I need to isolate? Forensics. I need to go retain any point of contact that they might have had with me. And all of a sudden, you're talking about 80 hours, 120 hours, 160 hours for each of these letters that you're getting many, many times a week. And it adds up fast. And so we think you need to get on top of it. And just as much as we think a vendor ought to go out there and do the gold standard and use it as a competitive advantage in the marketplace, we think the relying party, the enterprise that does business with thousands of risk of vendors, should ask for HITRUST. And if not HITRUST, something else. But at the end of the day, this decision to go make these outsourcing business arrangements has a pretty severe impact on cybersecurity posture. And if you're not doing this, asking for HITRUST or an independent external assessment, when the regulators come knocking or your customers come knocking, I just wonder what you're going to say. Here is a system that's proven to work, that has aggregated data over a decade or more, that has proven outcomes, and I don't know why you wouldn't at least ask for it. Asking, and here's kind of the line. If you take away one thing from our webinar, it is this: doing business with third parties has a cost associated with it, and loss expectancy, etc. And asking for HITRUST is free. What a great way to lower the risk in your supply chain. You're less likely to be compromised. You're less likely to lose data through the supply chain. You're less likely to suffer unexpected downtime. And all you had to do was ask for HITRUST. Maybe there's some negotiation there, but generally asking for another company to do HITRUST is free.
Absolutely. You mentioned that the cost of negative impacts when it comes to vendors. Think about your reputational cost as well. Um, I know for a fact I've worked with someone that was looking for a new doctor who specifically went out and looked at what type of breaches they'd had. The government has the wall of shame, right, where you have to self-report and you get that information. You don't want to be on that wall. So, and one of the higher risks is the use of third parties. So, having that unified third-party TPRM system is always one of the best solutions to make sure you're limiting the risk, lowering the risk as much as you can. So here's some bit, just kind of an overview. You want to take this one, Jason? Business outcomes and measurable impacts. We can kind of join together here.
Yeah, I mean, the HITRUST is, it's that 1% number. At the end of the day, and I see another great question in the chat around like how involved is a HITRUST assessment? And I think it is also important to be clear that you're not asking for a checkbox. You're not
No.
asking for a technology solution, $12,000 automated compliance report. And those exist in the market and they're unfortunately common. You're asking a company to go through an organizational wide commitment to information security. And Andrea's done enough of these to know when a HITRUST assessment is successful, it starts at the top. There is executive buy-in. This is not a function of hand it to the IT manager and let him harden things or let her harden things. This is a true enterprise risk management framework, and it requires buy-in from legal, HR, facilities, administrative support, procurement, IT ops, development, and I can go on and on and on because every part of the enterprise needs to buy in order to make this work. Now, because it's so challenging, and we think that's the reason there's good outcomes. In fact, we know that's the reason there's good outcomes. If something is fast and easy, the question is it really worth it?
Oh,
And that's a debate that we're having in the marketplace. There have been scandals. I won't do any name dropping. I won't talk about any incidents, but what we found is that the more friction that is involved up front, the better the outcomes on the back. So if you do 500 controls from HITRUST and they are operationally effective, and that's QA'd by the external assessor who has to have it reviewed by their engagement manager, who has to have it reviewed by a quality, high trust quality professional. And then on high trust, we do 5 layers of QA. You know that thing is working. And that has led to vastly reduced numbers of compromise in the marketplace. I think that goes hand in hand with some of the GORICO outcomes here, which is, this is not an easy thing. This is an administrative burden. You do need to find your contracts, figure out what their commitments are. Do you have a right to audit? Can you renegotiate it? Who's the point of contact? And by the way, they probably switch jobs a couple times, so you need a new point of contact. You could go ask them to do this assessment report, and they'll probably say, no, I'm not going to do that. Well, this is, and the companies that take it very seriously will say, well, you need to go do that, or we're going to find a vendor who will, because the price that you're charging us is not inclusive of the loss expectancy, of the idea that there might be a compromise or damage to our brand. And what I really like about GORICO is it makes it easy to go find those contacts, understand what you're doing with them, issue these requests for high trust or other assessments, understand the inherent risk associated with them, and ultimately measure and manage the risk. And I would ask anyone on this call, if you had to put a number on it, if you take the cost associated with a breach, I told you it's 10 million. Every company is going to have their own number. And the likelihood that a breach occurs, I told you it's maybe 15%. And you take 15% times 10 million, $150,000, right? And then you times it by the number of vendors you have, 10,000 vendors. How much can you expect to lose in a year because of third parties? And if you don't have that number ready for your executive team, for your board of directors, then the answer is you're not managing the risk. You're falling through this by accident because companies have been forced to outsource, because it is a competitive advantage. And a lot of times that just means that the enterprise has assumed these costs really by accident.
So I think what we're learning here is whether you're an organization that's going to require a standard high trust assessment from each of the vendors that you'd want to do business with, and or use a product like GORICO to create that unified vendor assurance process. Getting that unified process in place is incredibly important, because trying to manage it through those disconnected tools and siloed assessments and that manual process of trying to manage those relationships, it just doesn't work anymore, especially as your vendor number grows. So that unified approach always is going to be the best way to do that. So, and it also allows you to scale, right? So that managing 500 vendors or 50,000 vendors, I know you mentioned 10,000 earlier, Jason. We have organizations that have 50,000 vendors. That you've got to have that cohesive framework that with the integrated technology, GORICO, for instance, consistent processes and collaborative workflows so you can keep pace with the growth and expand those vendor lists without resource drain. So I think, unless you have anything else to add, I think we've come to the end of the webinar. I think we have some time for some questions.
All right.
All right. So yeah, go ahead, Priya.
We have a few questions about all the things that we went through. One of the most prominent question that I'm seeing around is around, of course, the AI. So how we are tracking. So the first question I want to take it up is how do we track risk of third-party AI users when we may not have insight into their newer operation, which includes AI?
So I can take this one, Jason. I can give you 2 examples of what we just discussed can help in that. So on the high trust side, there are specific assessments within the high trust framework that address 2 kind of sets of AI approaches. There's an AI risk management assessment, and there's also an AI security assessment that results in an actual separate certification. So if you've got vendors, for instance, that are using AI, you could ask them to perform or have performed add these additional controls into a high trust assessment and assess their AI tools, assess their AI systems. That gives you, as the relying party, information about the security of those systems. And then from the AI standpoint, if you weren't using a high trust assessment, for instance, if you wanted to focus on particular questions to ask your vendors around AI systems or AI tools, that being able to create those individual questionnaires within GORICO, you can then evaluate the vendor's AI tools or systems that way as well. And
I think maybe a little more color from the HITRUST side is, I think everyone in the market has a tendency to lump this into one thing, like, oh, you have AI, I need an AI solution. And the fact of the matter is that the inherent risk associated with vendors using AI varies based on their use case. And so I think probably the most elementary introduction of AI would be, hey, we have access to a chat bot. We go to chatgpt.com. Maybe we have an enterprise solution, and what data gets leaked? Well, that's no different than personal email, right? That's the same threat vector. Dropbox, Google Drive. We've been dealing with this in the marketplace for a long time. We have all sorts of controls around web content filtering and DLP to manage this idea that you might put proprietary information into a chatbot. Now, I think one more layer is what happens when some of the solutions we've been using for a long time, maybe you've got a SaaS solution, we'll just say some sort of enterprise management, and all of a sudden you log into it on one Monday morning and there's a chatbot in the bottom corner. Well, now that's different, right? This is no longer employees leaking data or spilling data into a chatbot. This is the integration of an LLM into a SaaS product that a company is contracted to use. And that SaaS product has information to sensitive data. And that's interesting because when you think about the architecture, it usually happens one of a couple of ways. If you just talk to that chatbot, it might send data by API back to OpenAI or Gemini or Anthropic or whomever. And that's one threat vector or one architecture that comes with a certain set of threat vectors. And another is what we see is there are model escrows. And so many of us have heard of things like Amazon Bedrock or the equivalents with the other major cloud providers. We don't have favorites here. And what happens is the model provider actually never sees the input when you use this escrow solution. It stays solely at the cloud provider, and that comes with a totally different architecture and set of threat vectors. And so what I would urge everyone on the phone to do is when you think about how do we measure risk associated with AI and manage that risk, think about the unique architecture of the AI system and the use case before you go out and start making decisions on how to protect it. The other thing that's really interesting that I see from Stephen D in the chat is you're right. This AI, it gets snuck in. Like you didn't pay for it. You didn't put it in the statement of work. You didn't ask for this LLM. You get an unsolicited LLM showing up in your product that you didn't ask for, and it wasn't subject to the due diligence or the pre-contract evaluation or anything else. And it comes with risks, and a lot of times it is only after the LLM is integrated that the relying party has to deal with some of this.
Right.
Thanks, Jason.
Andrea?
Yep. I was just going to say, it looks like we had another question for another HITRUST question.
Yeah, we have now the next question is around HITRUST. Like, what tips would you give to those thinking about where to start with HITRUST? I think you both are the perfect person to answer.
Yeah. So Andrea does a lot of HITRUST assessments. I'll kick it off and throw it to her. And I've turned in hundreds over the years. And I hinted at this earlier, but HITRUST is not a quick and easy solution. It is not an automatic pay 15 grand and have a CPA sign it solution. Generally the costs are 10 times that and much more if you think about total cost of ownership. if anyone on the phone or anyone is thinking about going to get HITRUST, the first question is why. And it might be that somebody is asking you for it, and companies find a lot of value in this, so they ask for it. Or it might be that you want to be ready when you go to market, and a company does ask for it. So you don't want to wait until you're answering the RFP proposal to say, we'll go out and get it. You want to go get it beforehand so that you can be ready. And we actually have solutions for that here too, if you want to do the lightest version of HITRUST and then step up to a larger version later, a more rigorous version. And Andrea will have all of the details on those. And then once you understand why you're doing it, you need to take the company considering whether or not to do HITRUST should stop and pause and think, as an enterprise, are we bought into this? We've made the decision to do this because we think there's market share there, or because we've been asked to do it by a critical customer, or because we think it's a best practice and we want to protect ourselves. Let's stop and think about what's entailed in that. Because it is not, and I mentioned before, it's not a delegated to a HITRUST manager or an IT manager or the cybersecurity team. Every part of the business will see HITRUST in some way or another. If for no other reason, because you've got to give everybody in the business training. But also the way you operate might change, right? Your laptops might have different configurations. Your receiving and shipping and inventory management and sensitive systems like payroll and enterprise resource planning are all going to change in a way ultimately that lends itself to the protection of sensitive data.
Yeah,
And then
you covered that.
We'll get you started.
You covered that very well. So I would say the same thing. The reason why you're looking at a HITRUST certification is always where you should start. So if you're, let's say you're a third party, you want to do business with an organization, you're filling out that RFP. If there is a requirement that you need to have a HITRUST certification, there's your reason. But for marketing purposes, there are those various other types of assessments that you can perform. So HITRUST assesses systems, not the entire organization. So it is absolutely scalable. So if for some reason you've got a particular application that you want to market in the future, or you've got an application specifically that one of your clients is using, you can perform that HITRUST assessment just on that application in the back end of it to meet those regulatory or contractual requirements for any customers. And there's a variety of different assessments that you can use to go through it. I think Jason kind of touched on it, a HITRUST journey, as we call it, from a fundamental all the way through an implementation, all the way to an R2, which is a true risk-based HITRUST assessment. A lot of different options when you first determine what the need is. Why do you need the certification? And we are at time, so I don't want to keep everybody too long and monopolize your day. Any questions that came through that we haven't answered, we will get back to you via email. So just know that we appreciate you being here. Hopefully through our discussion today, you've determined that third-party risk management is important for every organization, and having that unified assurance process certainly helps to eliminate stress. You have a more complete process, and it just makes better sense for third-party risk management all the way around. So again, thanks for attending today, and we'll answer your questions in email. Thanks, everybody.